Well, Acts 25 does, I think, feel very much like a repeat of Acts 24, and that's because, in a sense, it is. There's a change of governor, yes. Felix has been replaced by Festus, and 2 whole years have passed by, so there's been a movement in time. But otherwise, it is the same man, the Apostle Paul, on trial for the same trumped-up charges brought by the same Jewish leaders. And it makes you wonder, well, what's the point of all this? And why has Luke spent such a long time detailing it? I mean, surely Acts 23 to 26 could have been summarized in just a few verses. Well, no doubt there are reasons for it, and I thought of one or two. The first is simply this, that Luke is a careful historian. And I think the details of these chapters give great credibility to his overall account. It has the ring of authenticity, doesn't it? It's likely, though we can't be certain, that this 2-year period was the time when Luke started making notes and conducting his research for both Luke's Gospel and Acts. And presumably he starts with what is currently happening before going backwards in time, so to speak, and interviewing people about the events of earlier on in the Acts. So it would make sense, wouldn't it, for him to be particularly focused on the events that were happening right in front of his eyes. But I think there's another reason why Luke includes this detail, because it's easy, isn't it, to read Acts superficially and to think that miracles and visions and spectacular events were happening on more or less a daily basis. And that wasn't the case. There are large time jumps in Acts. What we get are the highlights, but in between times, we get a lot of what we might call ordinary Christianity, unspectacular, everyday faith. Believers learning to walk with the Lord in the ordinary activities of life. And I think Luke is highlighting just that in these chapters. In a book where we've had prison breaks and dramatic angel deliverances, well, Paul experiences none of that here, does he? Instead, we've got a very modern, sadly familiar story of a drawn-out legal battle and due process, a man who has to remain in custody for over 2 years while it all drags out. It's life, isn't it? It's life in a fallen world. It's ordinary, it's unspectacular, and dare I say it, it's boring Christianity. And yet, at the end of it all, Paul is not embittered, he's not disillusioned. In all seasons, for better or for worse, Paul was walking by faith with his Saviour. And the Lord was with him, just as he's with us. I mean, are we really to say that the Lord is only with us when he's doing some mighty miracle, or whether he's dramatically healed us of some illness? Is he only with the church when we're growing and when converts are flooding in? Or is the Lord with us in lean times as well? In fact, is he not really with us at all times and in all things? And I think we know the answer, don't we? Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. I think that is exactly what Luke is demonstrating here by recording these seemingly monotonous and unremarkable events. And I was thinking about Val, actually, who's lying in a lot of pain in her bed in Hillcrest, and she's ready to meet the Lord, and in the Lord's providence, she's lingering. She hasn't gone over the river, she hasn't gone straight to glory. And does that mean that the Lord has deserted her? Well, we know the answer. Of course he hasn't. The Lord is still with her. Now, I'm reminded of that old hymn. It says, "Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face." And I think we see that here in Acts 25. So let's get straight into the action. I'm not sure there's a lot of action, but there we go. At the end of chapter 24, Felix is succeeded by Porcius Festus. And that makes it sound like it was a very simple, peaceful transition, but it wasn't really. Violence had broken out between the Jewish and Syrian citizens of Caesarea. And as seems to have usually happened, Felix had been rather heavy-handed in how he had dealt with it. And the Jews had gone over his head and they'd complained to Caesar. And Caesar had recalled Felix and asked him to give an account of himself. Now, as it turned out, Felix escaped punishment. but he still lost his job. And his replacement is Festus, a very different character. Now, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, Festus was both more honest and more capable than his predecessor. And he was certainly far more energetic. Now, as we remember from last time, Felix was a procrastinator. He still hadn't dealt with Paul's situation after 2 years. Festus, he's far more decisive. And we get a sense of that straight away. No time to get his feet under the desk. Within 3 days of arriving in the province, he's immediately gone down to Jerusalem. He knows that Judea is a volatile province, and for the sake of stability and continuity, it is vital that he secures the confidence of the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem. So he doesn't put it off, he goes down there straight away. Now, just in passing, notice that he speaks to a group of people called the chief priests. And I think this is just an indication straight away that all is not well in Judea. You see, in the Old Testament, there was the high priest, and he was high priest until he died. But the role had long since become a kind of political football. Ambitious politicians, sycophants, and schemers who were appointed by the Romans and often just as quickly removed. But like a bad smell, they lingered, and they still wielded great influence behind the scenes. Hence this phrase, chief priests. For there were many living ex-high priests, and they all still felt they were important. And these are the men who dominated the Jewish Sanhedrin. And of course they were Sadducees, which meant that they didn't believe in the resurrection, they didn't believe in angels or demons. In fact, they stood for very little, except for power and keeping hold of power. Perhaps not unlike some of our Church of England bishops today. They were not against Paul because of Paul's theology, couldn't really care less about theology. They were against him because in their minds, Paul threatened their positions of power. And you might think by this point, well, they must have forgotten Paul. Because Paul had been languishing in prison for 2 years, why did they still care? Well, they realized that this new Roman governor might decide to do a bit of overdue spring cleaning and reopen and release Paul, having reopened his case. So they want to get there quickly, ahead of time. And they immediately present their charges against Paul to Festus. And we're told in verse 3 that they urgently requested that Festus, as a favor to them, have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. Why? Well, because they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Now, that is something they'd already tried before, 2 years earlier, and it hadn't succeeded. It had been foiled by the actions of Paul's nephew. And Festus, I'm sure, had read the report, and he's no fool. But in any case, Festus had no intention of allowing himself to be manipulated so early on in the job. Things were going to be done properly. Caesarea was the capital of the Roman province of Judea. Caesarea was the seat of the Roman governor. So Caesarea is the right and proper place for them to go and present their charges against Paul. That's what's going to happen. Now notice what Festus adds in verse 5. You may press charges against the man there if he has done anything wrong. So Festus must have known from the documents left by Felix that Paul was, in fact, an innocent man, and guilt had not been and was unlikely to ever be established. But there we go. 10 days later, Festus arrives back in Caesarea, and as efficient as ever, he immediately convenes a court hearing for the very next day. Just imagine if Festus was the Prime Minister of the UK, things would happen very, very quickly and efficiently, wouldn't they? And what we have in these next verses is basically a reopening of the same old case. Now, I'm not going to cover in detail all the charges that were made in Acts 24 because Luke doesn't cover them in detail. He simply, rather pithily, summarizes it like this: bringing many serious charges against him which they could not prove, which has always been the problem. There never was any substantive evidence because the charges were either downright lies or gross distortions of the truth. And so, despite having had over 2 years to work on their case, the Jewish leaders still had no case at all. Now, the substance of these charges is implied in Paul's own defense. He says, I have done no wrong against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Now, all through his time in Jerusalem, Paul had behaved impeccably. He had behaved in an orthodox Jewish manner. He hadn't broken any laws. He certainly hadn't taken a Gentile into the inner courts of the temple. And moreover, he wasn't seditious. He was not preaching rebellion against the Romans at all. He was a responsible Roman citizen. And that should really have been that. 2 trials, 2 failures to convict Paul. But Festus was new in the job. He was green behind the ears. He was inexperienced, capable though he was, and energetic, and he felt that he needed to keep the Jewish leaders on side, to throw them a bone, so to speak. And so he says to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" Now, it goes without saying that this would have been totally pointless. A change of location wasn't going to change the facts of the case. The best you could say is that perhaps not all of the Jewish leaders had been able to get across to Caesarea, and this was perhaps a way of ensuring their full participation. But it wasn't going to change the fact that they had a weak case. Now, to Festus, it no doubt seemed politically expedient, but he was rather naive if he didn't realize that this was going to place Paul in extreme physical jeopardy. Or perhaps he did realize it. Perhaps it was a cynical move to get rid of the Paul problem once and for all. We don't really know. But either way, what we do know is that Paul wasn't impressed at all. See, like expecting chickens to vote for Christmas, Festus is effectively asking Paul if he's willing to go to his own death in Jerusalem. It was ludicrous. What did he expect Paul to say? But in Paul's reply to Festus, in verse 10, there was actually an implicit rebuke. He says, "I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well." So this was a complete failure of Roman justice. Paul is an innocent Roman citizen. His innocence has been completely established more than once, and Festus, who is standing there as the local representative for Caesar, should have been able to acquit Paul. But if Festus didn't feel up to the job of doing that, well, Paul is going to go over his head and appeal to the supreme Roman judge, Caesar himself. He says, "If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Now, Paul was not afraid of dying. That's the first thing to say. The fear of death is the biggest fear in our world, and people over the years have gone to extraordinary lengths and done terrible things to avoid death, to buy a little more time for themselves. And this is not how Paul operates. Paul has a unique perspective, which he articulates just a few years later when he writes Philippians. To live is Christ, to die is gain. Now, Paul didn't have a death wish, but he could genuinely see the benefits in both life and death. His attitude was very much, well, I can't lose. If I go on living, well, that's more opportunity for the Lord, more fruitful gospel ministry in his service, which is great. But if I die and I depart, I'm going to be with Christ. And that's even better. That's gain. So I can't lose, is Paul's attitude. So, of course, he wasn't afraid of dying. But neither was he desperately trying to avoid justice. If it could be proved that he had done wrong, well, if he'd done the crime, he would do the time, so to speak. But Paul had a clear conscience. He knew he'd done nothing wrong. Why should he die for crimes that he did not commit? The question was, where, other than in God's heavenly courtroom, could justice ever be found for Paul? And this is where we have Paul's trump card, the nuclear option, if you like. It was the right of every Roman citizen that they could appeal against the verdict of a local magistrate by going to the highest court in the empire, Caesar's court. Now, Paul could have activated this right a lot earlier, but he was a wise man and a patient man, and while Felix remained the governor, there was still the hope that he might eventually release Paul. So Paul had held back. But now, with the complete collapse of local Roman justice and faced with being put into the hands of these vindictive Jewish leaders, this really was Paul's only alternative. Now, given what we know about Nero, the Roman emperor of the day, you might think that this is a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire, because as we know from our history books, Nero was a deranged psychopath who 6 years later launched an extreme persecution against the Christian church. But that's all with the benefit of hindsight. At this point, in the early years of Nero's reign, believe it or not, there was stability. He hadn't quite been unmasked at this point. But in any case, there was logic to Paul's case. Festus was clearly too influenced, too compromised, too preoccupied with Jewish sensibilities to render justice here. And Rome was 3,500 miles away. There was far more chance of a fair hearing for Paul there. And the truth is, well, Festus himself probably agreed. I imagine he was very relieved to have Paul taken out of his hands. You have appealed to Caesar you will go. And you can imagine he slept a lot easier that night. And that's pretty much that. But we're not going to end there, because you see, what I want to just emphasize is that Paul was not driven just by pragmatism or by logic. Because, as I've already said, this wasn't about selfish self-preservation. The reason that Paul didn't want to die in Jerusalem was because of a God-given desire that burned within his heart. Way back in Acts 19, while Paul was still in Ephesus, he had said, I must visit Rome also. So Paul longed to go to the center of the known world, the beating heart of the empire, that the wonders of the world, Rome. And he wanted to go there and proclaim Jesus Christ there. And Paul knew that this desire was not just his, he knew it was from the Lord because of what the Lord had said to him back in chapter 23. Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. And whether you believe this or not, Paul was not receiving heavenly visions every day of the week. And so when the Lord spoke to him in that way, well, of course, Paul was going to remember it, and he had treasured it up in his heart. But here's the thing, Paul did not know exactly when or how that was going to happen. And he wasn't going to jump the gun by taking matters into his own hands. And that was why he had not appealed to Caesar earlier on. He could have done. But because Paul believed that God was sovereign, he didn't feel the need to sort of rush God into things or help God along. And so he patiently waited on the Lord, keeping the Lord's words in his heart, treasuring them. And when it became clear that death in Jerusalem really was the only alternative, then he made his move, presumably making it in silent prayer and dependent faith. It's a lesson to us, isn't it? That God's ways are not our ways. God's time is not our time. God will achieve his purposes both in the church and in our individual lives as Christians and in the world, but in his way and by his means. And we're not to try and jump the gun. And yet, often we feel we do know better than God, don't we? We want to take the shortcut, the more convenient way, or the more enjoyable way, because we feel we know better. Prayerfully seeking God, trusting his will for our lives is hard. And the temptation to usurp God's sovereignty, to assume control of the process, is a very real temptation for each of us here. It is a test of our faith. Will we depend on the Lord, or will we lean on our own intuition and do what we feel is right? As we know, feelings are quite tricky things. They're up and down, left and right. They're not always correct, but boy, do we think they are. Will we wait for the Lord to satisfy our souls and provide what we need, or will we give in to our own sinful desires? Stopping, stilling your heart, seeking the Lord, waiting for his guidance is very difficult, especially when it may mean surrendering your ambitions or your sinful desires. But that's the way of faith, isn't it? It does tend to be difficult, but it is how the Lord teaches us. It's how he refines us in the furnace. We must never assume as a church or as individuals that the easy, pain-free way is God's way and God's will. It would be wonderful if it was. We're not looking for suffering, but we mustn't assume that that's the case. We mustn't just plump for the convenient and the cost-free. We need to wait for the Lord. I prayed this morning for clemency, that famous promise in Proverbs 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And Paul lived that out. We might well wonder, well, what on earth did Paul do in those 2 years? Yes, we know he had private audiences with Felix, he had opportunities to witness to him, and he had visits from friends, but most of the time, most of the day, he would have been stuck in prison, alone. Plenty of time to fritter away on self-pity, bitterness, despair. Perhaps he could have been plotting his escape or digging through the wall or something like that. But Paul was submitted to the will of God. He was a man of considerable intellect and capacity. It wasn't a case of him shutting those things down. Paul wasn't a passive man who made no decisions, but his native intellect and his wisdom were surrendered and submitted to God's will and harnessed by God. And by faith, Paul was able to wait for God's time. And therefore, we know by the way Paul conducts himself all the way through these chapters, the quiet dignity, the wisdom he shows, that Paul had never lost heart. He never lost his faith in the Lord, even though he was falsely accused of crimes he'd never committed. I asked the question a few moments ago, where, other than in God's heavenly courtroom, can true justice ever be established? When will we be fully vindicated and acquitted? And the answer is, well, not in this life. True and lasting justice is elusive in this life. We know, don't we, each of us, that sometimes we get falsely accused by non-Christians and we don't get vindicated and they think badly of us and there's nothing we can do about it. That's a fallen world, isn't it? It's a world that hates God and hates God's people, a world opposed to the church. We're not going to get justice in this life. But remember David's words in Psalm 37. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, the justice of your cause like the noonday sun. In other words, I think David is saying there, let God be God. He will do your vindicating, and he'll do it better than you ever could. One eternal day. There's an old poem that you've probably heard that says, though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceeding small. Though with patience he stands waiting, with exactness grinds he all. See, Paul waited over 2 years, which is a long time. And even at the end, justice is still not forthcoming. But 2 weeks, 2 years, 2 months, 2 decades, a lifetime, it's no time, is it, to eternal God? And on the day that he's appointed, inevitably and precisely and thoroughly and finally, he will vindicate his own and his justice will reign. And I think really the final lesson here is that the Lord, we need to pray that he'll help us so that we will be more like Paul than I think we are, that we will be a contented people who play the long game, who trust in the Lord and rest in his power to keep and his eternal justice. As the old hymn says, God shall alone the refuge be and comfort of the mind, too wise to be mistaken he, too good to be unkind. Amen.